Sabrina 2000s comic, issue 4. We start out with Salem asking Sabrina how her trip to the dentist was, and Sabrina complains that she had to have a tooth pulled. There's no excuse for her tooth not just being teleported out of her mouth with magic for free, instead of her entire family looking like a bunch of idiots, as the series seems to forget that she's not a normal teenager. It should have been explained they think paying a dentist for his services is the right thing to do. Or 2, it was noticed that Sabrina needed her tooth pulled by a mortal, and obviously if her tooth was mysteriously absent the next time she'd visit the dentist, that would raise suspicion. Of course, they could have just told the dentist that Hilda had a string tied to her tooth and a doorknob, and closed the door. So that's not an excuse. I can understand Sabrina needing to see a dentist on a regular basis because the dentist would know a lot about teeth and she wouldn't. So she wouldn't know when she'd have to use magic to fix her teeth and she wouldn't know what to do. All she'd know is to use magic to whiten them. Anyways, it's nice of Hilda to say that Sabrina was brave. And it was surprisingly nice of Salem, of all people, to bother asking how the trip to the dentist was instead of just caring about himself. That's notably out of character. Hilda tells Sabrina to lie down and rest, like Dr. Greymatter said. What the hell kind of name is that? No one would have that last name. And no one would change their last name to that either. You'd think he'd be a neuroscientist instead. Hilda says that she'll bring her a cup of tea. Is everyone in this house so bad at magic that they can't just think about how tea tastes and then point and zap some tea up? What's the point of the story? Sabrina complains that the dentist still treats her like a little kid. Well, she does look like one. Abandoning the Archie Comics art style after 30 years didn't do her any favors. And we see a bunch of dentist advice, like brush your teeth after every meal, and floss your teeth every day. Who the fuck would do that? That sounds so inconvenient. Like, I'd have to go all the way downstairs every single time, on top of everything else. And flossing feels horrible. It feels like your teeth aren't meant to have a narrow string lodged between them, and it's gonna separate them forcibly a bit. I fucking hate how condescending it is that the artist had Salem look at the audience and say that we should use those tips. Fuck you! You're not telling me what to do. And this is extremely out of character for Salem. He's all about bites because he tried to take over the world. At least it's in character for Salem to say, I'm always pro-nap. So far the story is slow pacing and feels really boring. Hilda tells Sabrina that the dentist saved her tooth so that she could put it under her pillow for the tooth fairy. Why is she so stupid that instead of responding to what Sabrina said like a real person, she just ignores it? She tells her to relax and reminds her to put the tooth under her pillow again. This panel didn't need to exist. Sabrina tells Salem that she doesn't believe in the tooth fairy anymore. She's a witch. Then Salem says not to diss the fairies because they have very strong magic. Stronger than witches, who can do literally anything? In most of the franchise, it seems like the witches are the omnipotent ones, and I barely noticed the fairies having any powers at all. I can understand why Sabrina didn't believe in the tooth fairy, because that's a very common myth told to little kids who aren't witches, so that they won't know the monies from their parents and hit them up for money. But you'd think she would have been told the tooth fairy was real, shown actual evidence, since she's a witch and knew that all along. So she's allowed to know the truth. Salem says that fairies have a very powerful union and can be dangerous, and witches can't. He says fairies can be dangerous. Either this comic is going to have the lazy writing and pro-discrimination message that all fairies are evil, which the 90s comic already made the mistake of, or witches are racist against fairies. I assume they live in separate worlds, so of course they don't learn to trust each other. I also assume that fairies are allowed to abuse their magic against witches. Due to racism against witches from fairies, what else? That's the only reason witches would be afraid of them. That would make sense. Even then, you'd think any witch would just use magic to instantly freeze a fairy in a block of ice, or even depower them entirely. Sabrina puts the tooth under her pillow reluctantly, and Salem says that protecting her is his job. Since when? Do you want him to be a former villain or not? Then he thinks he heard something near Sabrina's head and tells her to wake up and jumps as Sabrina screams. And then he thinks he acted hastily. It turns out he attacked the male tooth fairy as a result. He acts like he made a mistake. but he told Sabrina he wanted to protect her. So he was telling her to humor the Tooth Fairy and put a tooth under her pillow. Trying to attack the Tooth Fairy is the opposite of humoring him. So why did he do it? I don't care that he just woke up. He shouldn't have even been in Sabrina's bed in the first place if he knew the Tooth Fairy was gonna show up, and therefore wake him up and startle him. Logically, if he's dumb enough to make this mistake, how has this not happened before? Wouldn't he have attacked him the first time she put her tooth under her pillow, instead of it taking this long? At least the Tooth Fairy being a guy is more interesting. It's trying to make up for the fact that it's using something that's such a cliche that I was bored just at hearing it get mentioned. Salem apologizes and says that his feline instincts kicked in. It turns out he kicked in his wing. Then because Salem's a talking cat, he looks in a small book that I have to assume he teleported to him. And then he finds out Salem's an evil witch serving time. And that makes a difference. Salem, just use magic on him. Freeze him in an ice cube before it's too late. I guess the reason this book exists is so that Tooth Fairies can know which to discriminate against. He shouldn't have needed a book to tell him that a talking cat, go figure, means that witches are about. He doesn't call Salem by his name or even full name. Sabrina wouldn't be asking what he means if her aunt had been smart enough to tell her all about fairies and warn her about this. You'd think this would have been an early part of her magic homework because it'd be for her own good. You'd think she'd be told to sleep somewhere other than her bed when she has a tooth under her bed. Not to mention I'm hoping there's going to be a very good explanation for why the hell a fairy would even want to collect teeth and leave money when he doesn't have to. I guess he's got a creepy obsession with teeth, but nothing forces him to leave money for it. I guess he's that charitable. And you'd think if there really was a Tooth Fairy, sooner or later a kid would leave a camcorder on, or their cell phone's camera on, to try to catch the Tooth Fairy in the act. So if he was real, we'd know about it. Of course, the footage would be called faked anyways. But if it was like a 4-year-old, why would anyone think a 4-year-old was able to fake that? The Tooth Fairy says that someone's gonna make the situation right, and that means Sabrina. Sabrina's confused, and tells Salem to go get Hilda. Why doesn't she say Hilda or Zelda? Why is Hilda her favorite in this comic? More importantly, why the fuck didn't Salem know to run out of the room 3 panels ago? He's older than Sabrina, so we'd know what's coming. And he sure as fuck wouldn't just look bored and unhappy instead of terrified. Why didn't one of them just teleport Hilda here? I assume the Tooth Fairy plans on torturing Sabrina. And he basically does because he teleports her out of the house and changes her into his temporary substitute Tooth Fairy, instead of just asking for his wing to be healed. This is confusing because I thought it was supposed to be charitable. Sabrina asks how they got outside. She's surprised that a fairy has magic. I guess it makes sense that she'd only picture fairies as flying around and healing Link. She says that Salem said they have powerful magic, and the Tooth Fairy says that that's why it was easy for him to teleport them here, as well as change Sabrina to Fairy. Another plot that was already done in the 90s comic. I refuse to believe that it wouldn't be just as easy for a witch to do that. This guy wouldn't look like a creepy, scummy kidnapper if Sabrina was the one who asked to fill in for him. That'd show off Sabrina's good side. She also never just healed the wing with magic. Why didn't Salem or Sabrina point at the wing and immediately imagine that it wasn't broken anymore? I guess I'm supposed to assume that fairies have a fairy council enchantment on them that makes the spells of witches unable to go through their bodies and infect them, and therefore it'd be impossible for Sabrina to heal the wing. But if that's not explained, it's a plot hole. Because otherwise, you'd think Sabrina would just instantly teleport him back to her after he left before giving her full instructions. Logically, I have to wonder why he doesn't heal his wing with his own magic. I assume he can, and he's just using this as an excuse to take a break. Maybe as an anti-pain spell. You'd think that someone would ask why he doesn't heal himself if he has powerful magic. Sabrina thinks it's cool that she can fly. At least she finds some enjoyment in the situation, but it was always obvious that she could fly herself. He says that because of this, she can take over his route. Why does she need to fly to be able to do that? I guess just in case she needs to go in through a high window. She seems to be regular size here though, not tiny like a fairy. Maybe the flight's purpose is to be fast. Logically, to avoid being found out, a Tooth Fairy would have to be invisible and have a spell cast that would make her unable to make noise no matter what. I'm guessing Sabrina won't have those spells cast for her, because that showed that the writer actually thought about how the Tooth Fairy will be able to make sense, instead of just writing lazily because it's a kid's comic. And plus we want to have a plot with any kind of conflict that way other than Sabrina's bored of having to do the same thing over and over if she could never have a chance of being caught. But I prefer that because then the plot would end faster after a quick little montage. I'm also guessing that his spells against her are locked, so that's why she doesn't just immediately undo them and go back to bed. Another explanation could be that she could want to do his job because she feels bad for him for being injured. Or is it a hobby? He says root like it's a job. There would have to be a damn good explanation for why someone would be paid to steal kids' teeth and leave money behind. Sabrina's told to be back to her room by dawn because that's when the spell will thankfully wear off. Surprisingly, he's not that much of a monster that he's planning on keeping her as a Tooth Fairy forever. After how evil the pixie was in the 90s comic, I want to put it past him. She asks how she should do her job and is told that it's all in the book. Logically, she wouldn't need to ask him anything. She'd just use her magic to effortlessly get into every house she needs to. She sees a book and a bag for carrying the teeth all at once. Wouldn't that get really heavy? I guess her fairy form is stronger than it looks. The book has all the addresses she needs, and then after she happily starts flying, out of complete nowhere, a bat grabs her by the wings. And Sabrina panics and says that this might kill her even though she's a witch because she's lame in this comic. Sure, she's a fairy now, but even fairies have magic. She shouldn't have said that because she should have known she could just instantly warp the bat away. She's not Princess Peach. She smacks the bat in the head with a bag of teeth. At least that's interesting, seeing it be used as an inevitable weapon. I assume the bat isn't literally speaking a human language when it says it's going vegetarian. And it said his speech is being translated for the audience, in a much faster to read way than I'm just saying screech, and then the translation would be at the bottom of the panel with an asterisk, like Salem in the 90s comic, but that was better. If this is just what it looks like it's insulting my intelligence. How does a bat expect to go vegetarian anyways? I hope he's just saying this because of brain damage, because how would he even get vegetables? Sabrina says she's sorry to be abrupt, but she's gotta go. It's just confusing that she apologized for that of all things. This whole time I've been waiting for Hilda to rescue her. I assume that she can't warp Sabrina to her because she's immune to witch magic right now. I'm still waiting for the story itself to explain this immunity as a canon part of it. Otherwise, it's a giant plot hole. We see a montage of Sabrina doing her job as the Tooth Fairy with no difficulty at all. She says, "Wait till I tell Harvey that I saw his favorite hockey player." And then what? He'd ask how. Then she sees a kid who left a note saying to leave Pokemon cards instead of a coin. And Sabrina thinks she's not innocent because of this, instead of thinking of her as smart. I'm forced to assume she didn't give her what she wanted, even though she has fairy magic, because she wouldn't know what a Pokemon card looks like. It's the only excuse for why she didn't just zap it up with magic. If this comic is running off the logic that Sabrina doesn't care about video games just because she's a girl, then she wouldn't know what Pokemon cards look like either. I love that the comic was allowed to use the term Pokemon, instead of having to dance around copyright. Sabrina subtly comments on the fact that the bag has a spell on it that lets it hold a coin in it without running out of room at any point. I assume that there's a portal in it connecting to a pocket dimension containing coins. And anytime she pulls something out of it, she pulls out a coin because it summons a portal before her hand could hit the teeth in it. Well, anytime she puts a tooth in it, it's made to shrink to fit in the bag. That's just how the spell is programmed. She's impressed with the bag. And then we see an old man saying that some bug stole his dentures. He wouldn't have his dentures under his pillow. They'd be in a glass of water. And he wanted to see Sabrina as a bug. The story is so stupid. He'd freak out. His wife doesn't believe him, and I guess she's too attached to him to put him in a home if apparently he's got a history of saying crazy things. And then Sabrina reveals that she's on 37 East Main instead of West Main. She wouldn't have made that mistake. And the fact that she was spotted makes it all the more obvious that being invisible should be a part of the Tooth Fairy job, and somehow it isn't. How is she expecting not to get caught then? Logically, she'd wake up at least some people, because not everyone falls asleep as easily as other people. and some people aren't heavy sleepers, so they'd feel her lift up the pillow and get the tooth out. So she'd have to use a spell so that this wouldn't happen, and yet that's not what we're being told. What is the point if it's not going to make the Tooth Fairy story make sense? What's to be proud of when it comes to using this boring cliche if you're not going to write it well, and instead just keep all the same plot holes? It turns out the last person she has to go to is the awfully named Slugloaf, who she calls our school bully. First of all, his parents must have hated him to name him that. Maybe that's why he's so mad all the time. And second, how in the world could a school have only one bully? Gem's there too. And third, we clearly saw him hand lunch money to other bullies. I'm guessing those bullies belong to a different school. Then why on earth would Harvey have known to go there to try to beat him up? Was he just following him there? I mean, it's not like Gem's father never spends a lot of money on her. Gem's allowed to spend a lot of money. That makes it especially confusing that he's cheap enough to send her to public school. Another problem with the story is the sheer stupidity of the fact that Sabrina's talking. People would obviously hear her unless they're that deep in sleep, but you shouldn't assume that. Why is she talking about who Slugloaf is when she already knows? I assume she's only being written to say this to tell the audience members who didn't read the issue where he was last in who he is. But we don't need to know that. And it was immediately obvious that he was a stereotypical bully just by the shape of his head and hair. She says that she heard he was in a fight and he must have had a tooth knocked out. As I wonder why she's just been doing nothing the whole time she's been stating the obvious, she continues with that by complaining about nasty boy stuff in his room, like dirty socks, old bags of fries, and stacks of comic books because she's a sexist who thinks only men should like comics. Excuse me, she's in a comic book. The staff should be well aware that women buy comic books because otherwise there wouldn't be a female market for the Sabrina comics. I assume she's only talking about superhero comics, but she should say that then because this just looks like confusing self-deprecating humor. Also, why would dirty socks only be in boys' rooms? They're in my room too. They're there until it's time for them to get picked up and cleaned. Where else is she expecting the dirty socks to be? I doubt she's immune to having dirty socks in her room. Especially since her aunt seemed to act like every use of magic is abusing it. Then out of nowhere, an iguana lifts its head out of the box it's in, lifting up the lid with it because I assume it's not on tight enough after all the bully's experience. And it hits her with its tongue while somehow looking bored instead of freaked out at her. Sabrina screams while stating the obvious. I don't remember stating the obvious being nearly as frequent in the earlier comics. And the bully seems to react and say shut up. If he can hear that, then I was expecting him to wake up right away, considering how loud the dunce was being. Wanted the book tell her not to? I guess the book assumed she had common sense. I guess her talking is seeping into his dream instead. Then he wakes up and asks if a guy can get sleep anymore. And then he somehow acts totally oblivious to Sabrina, even though she was screaming right in front of him and smacking the iguana with the lid. Who the fuck is expected to not notice a plot hole like this? And if that was supposed to be the whole joke, that's a horrible joke. Forced obliviousness is horrible writing. It's just insulting. Why can't Sabrina just be spotted and then use magic to make him pass out and forget what happened? I better not be the only one who doesn't like this comic. Sabrina says she's ready to call it a night, as I'm still completely confused and horribly underwhelmed that there was no conflict at all, when that's what was being built up to. What's the point of using the bully character in particular then? But logically, even the bully would just freak out at seeing Sabrina. Then Sabrina flies out of the house and says that dawn is breaking. Oh, now she acts tired. But no, it's just that she's dazed because she was brought back to normal and suddenly fell. Where's the bags under her eyes? She's told that she's late, and the Tooth Fairy says everything seems to be in order, as Sabrina says she was expecting to be thanked for help. He says that's a laugh because all she did was dream the whole time. And then out of complete nowhere we see Salem tell her to wake up and tell her she's dreaming. Then the entire plot was pointless. And he acts confused and says that she fell asleep. Then we see the Tooth Fairy outside of her window anyways. And she's thankful that the coin under her pillow says thanks for your help. So she realizes that it was real. What's the point of that? At first I thought it was a writer cop-out where the thing was all just a dream, but I was about to actually compliment that because that would have justified the plot holes in that part of the story. Because it's just a dream, and so it doesn't have to make sense. Apparently it did happen, and Salem just had his memories rewritten, for no reason, or he's lying. Why was she briefly made to think it was all a dream? Was it just to mess with her? And I'm thanking her seems out of character at this point. So why would it make her pass out and wake up in bed? The story sucked. You know it sucks when it took forever to fully call out 12 pages of it. Just 12 pages took me over an hour. I assumed Sabrina was going to be forced to be the Tooth Fairy's slave with them being there the whole time. There also could have been a twist where it turned out his wing wasn't actually injured. Or like, the wing heals itself automatically after a little while. So he was just using this as an excuse for her to do his work. And that would have been great because it'd mean he'd be exposed as a villain later when Hilda would see him and find out he wasn't injured anymore. So she could have beaten him up. In the comedy page, Salem tells Sabrina to wake up at 4 AM where the moon's still out. I assume it's for a bad reason since it's a comedy page. He says he decided to have an early breakfast. He doesn't need to tell her that. And he asks her which sounds better, tuna with cheese bits or salmon and liver. Naturally, both sound disgusting to her. But he's been a cat for so long that he forgot she'd have that reaction. Or he's just a jerk. Why is he asking her this question instead of deciding for himself in a second? Better yet, he could eat them both, which is what I'd expect Salem to do. Thankfully, he gets punished for waking her up early when she needs all the sleep she can get, because both of the meals get thrown at his head. But that wasn't good enough or funny enough to be worth the comedy page. That page wasn't funny, it was a jerk-ass ball for Salem. I could understand him doing this to mess with Zelda, but not Sabrina. In the next story, Chloe tells Sabrina that it might be cool if they hosted a party for the future Popular Girls' club. She agrees to it, and Salem naturally yawns. It's almost like ripping off a generic cliche plot point is boring. I don't remember Sabrina being desperate to be in the popular crowd in the 70s comic. Probably because that's just cliche and boring. She just wanted to be a better friend of Archie's. It's annoying to me that Sabrina's text bubble spells out the acronym with a pink first letter for each word, and the acronym itself is in big pink text. It just made it take slightly longer to read. And you don't need to emphasize that they're girls by making the text pink. It also emphasizes that they're girls, having them obsess over want to be with the popular girls because, oh, that's a stereotypical thing to have teen girls do. Chloe says that they're right behind her, and naturally Sabrina's shocked that the club is coming right now. Why was Chloe so reckless? This goal of these two characters is just so immediately shallow that I'm bored because I can't take it seriously. Chloe does her hair and fortunately justifies that she had no time to warn Sabrina because the club just sprang the idea on her 5 minutes ago. And according to her, this is in character for them. I guess this was a point in history where kids didn't always have cell phones. Otherwise, she would have just called Sabrina. But even then, 5 minutes isn't any time to prepare for a party. What made the club think a party prepared in 5 minutes would be awesome? Well, maybe it is reasonable. I've never bothered to set up a party, so maybe this is realistic. Especially for a witch. No way time pressure should be a problem for her, realistically. See, I said realistically there. This comic thinks it's being realistic by having her use magic less. But it's not, because no witch would make so little use of her own abilities. Sabrina's told to get the drinks, while Chloe will get some goodies. And she lampshades how weird the potion ingredients are. They're just right out in the open where any mortal could find them. No wonder Chloe found out. Wasn't it established in the first issue that the potion ingredients are all hidden in one room, not in the goodies room? Sabrina says there should be some sodas in the cellar. Sabrina and Chloe set up the snacks, and why the fuck is Jem here? Why is she a member of the future Popular Girls Club? At first I assumed it was a club for girls who wanted to become popular but weren't. Logically, what we would be going with here is that Jem is one of those girls because everyone hates her. Well, so much for this story. They just arbitrarily shoehorned her in because she's a lazy, easy villain. The members of the club aren't impressed, and Gems awkwardly asks about a sports team of all things, and says that the conversation's as stale as the chip she's eating. They walk away bored, and Chloe somehow convinces herself that they've moved up the social ladder because of this. It would have been less frustrating if we saw at least one of them admit that it was their own fault for rushing Sabrina. Why is it called Future Popular Girls' Club if it's clearly Present Popular Girls' Club? And why were Sabrina and Chloe allowed to join them? Chloe admits that the chips really are stale. I'm glad this was confirmed, so it's not like Jem was just saying that because she's a designated bully character who always has to be rude. You think Sabrina could just unstale the chips, but no, that would be making things interesting. Sabrina then asks Chloe in a panic where she got the chips, and out of complete nowhere, it turns out this is where Quigley keeps his beloved potato chip collection. They're chips that resemble people, places, and things. And one of them is a prize-winning chip of Castro smoking a cigar. At least the comic was allowed to reference cigars. Normally I'd expect a gutless kids series like this to not be allowed to mention them at all. When Sabrina first panicked over this, I assumed she was panicking because Chloe unknowingly fed these girls magical chips with a specific spell on them. But that would actually be taking advantage of the concept of a witch in a modern world. Is this seriously all that the chips were? That's pretty lame because this kind of plot could be done in anything. Sabrina starts panicking and trying to make a completely unrealistic plan, which obviously is doomed to failure because girls obviously wouldn't be able to accurately describe every chip they eat. They would have just eaten them. Wouldn't at least some of the girls be on a diet? They're constantly pressured. Why is Sabrina even considering using a mere nail file to recreate the chips when magic is much cooler? Not to mention way faster. Couldn't she cast a spell to read their minds so that she'd see what they saw? No, that'd be cool. And she's not capable of anything. I hate that her eyes are drawn in squiggly circles here. Is this an anime thing? Why do this? We're not too stupid to understand how she's feeling. The earlier Sabrina comics never did this. Sabrina plans on looking up a time travel spell, finally, to stop Chloe from grabbing the chips, and somehow Chloe tells her to snap out of it at this point, instead of letting her do this plan, because God forbid she get to use magic. The story will be interesting to me either way at this point, in the sense that it's a new story. But it's still gonna be lame and underwhelming if no magic ever gets used. If this was the earlier Sabrina comics, we would have seen Sabrina zap up the snacks and drinks herself, which would have prevented this whole plot. I wish it was explained that the reason she just uses the food that's already in the house is that she really believes in paying for stuff at every opportunity. So it wouldn't be as morally righteous to zap up food instead of paying for it. And it'd be a waste of money to zap to the grocery store and buy the snacks and warp back. So she wouldn't want to do that either. And God forbid, that'd be using magic too. If you stretch that far to have magic be interpreted as always evil, teleporting would be the only thing that's not evil. And even then, you should be paying bus drivers. Chloe tells Sabrina to relax and just tell her uncle the truth. I thought Chloe's role in the comic was that she'd be the one encouraging the abuse of magic. Instead, she's doing the opposite. And it seems like she only wanted to abuse magic that one time because she was accidentally made invisible. God damn it. At least it's got a good intention here. It's trying to establish her as such a good person that she'd rather Sabrina tell her uncle the truth. But that's stupid. She should explain that she doesn't want Sabrina to live with the guilt for the rest of her life when she could just tell him the truth right away. But it was Chloe who messed up. She was the one who used the chips for snacks and invited people to a party at her house that she didn't want. It'd be totally unfair to only punish and get mad at Sabrina for this. What, because she let Chloe and the club members in the house? It was Chloe who agreed to the party against her will. And it was Chloe who the party idea was brought up with. Sabrina could have told them not to come in because she wasn't prepared enough to make a party. That's actually what I would have done. I'd be like, why try if it's going to be guaranteed to not be good enough? Sabrina's only indirectly responsible for this mess. Why isn't Chloe... Oh, good. She does admit in one panel, it's my bad, I grabbed the bowl. It's just an easy panel to forget and ignore because everyone's in silhouette for some reason. I guess the idea is Sabrina would be scolded for never thinking to warn Chloe that there's a chip collection in the house she shouldn't touch because she didn't think of Quigley enough. But maybe if Quigley wasn't brain dead, he would have kept the chip collection locked behind a padlock or glass containers that can't be opened, so that it'd be impossible for them to be mistaken for regular chips and eaten by the guests that show up in the house. It'd be sadistic if only Sabrina was punished for this. If he was really smart, he would have taken pictures of those chips, so it wouldn't matter if they were eaten. It turns out Quigley overheard their entire conversation about what happened, conveniently. He's thankfully smiling calmly and says, "First of all, I'd say thanks for being honest with me. Then I'd compliment you on your choice of friend." It sure is sweet that he's still smiling even though Sabrina was clearly being sarcastic about the idea of being honest with him, because naturally she was just afraid of being yelled at and punished. All he does is try to control what she does. Chloe fortunately thanks her. I like her hairstyle, and the fact that she gets a change of clothes. Oh, out of complete nowhere, it turns out Quigley didn't hear what Sabrina did, but he's nice enough to hug her anyways as she sheds a tear and sniffles. Sabrina thanks him, as I'm still really disappointed that he didn't hear what she actually did, because that would have been nice enough to spare her the trouble of having to tell him. It shouldn't be only her getting the blame though. He tells them there's a pile of reject chips in a bowl on the table and they're probably stale and should be thrown out. So the story ends with Sabrina saying Quig is right and she really is lucky to have a friend like Chloe, and she offers to give her a hug. Sadly, we don't get to see them hug, and instead Chloe just says, "Yeah, in a minute." She says that this chip really does look like Elvis, and she could really get into this, which is interesting, but the comic will probably never follow up on this and add to her character a little bit, instead staying completely free of continuity and missing the entire point of a comic book. So, he never lost any of his chip collection? Sabrina just assumed that the bowl of chips in the chip collection room was a bowl of prized chips. Well, that's a fair assumption to make. Maybe she assumed they were a bowl of chips meant to be put behind that glass that weren't yet. Or maybe, since all of the glass panels seemed to be full, he didn't have the room for them, so he kept them in the bowl. So it does make more logical sense that Quigley would be better at storing and protecting his prized collection than the story implied. And I'm glad they didn't have to be punished for an accident as a result. In the next story, Hilda says she and Zelda are on their way to the mall. Sabrina wants to go too, and Zelda says she'll only be allowed to go if she's finished her geography report. I guess she didn't. Yup, she didn't. I always thought of Zelda as looking a bit like a hippie, because she has long orange hair and spectacles, so it was always ironic to me that she wasn't lenient at all. But it makes sense for them to punish her for not finishing her report because it encourages her to do it and be responsible in general. That's so boring. Sabrina kicks a basketball in frustration and says that's a cool enough subject, the rainforest, but she just doesn't feel like doing research right now. Why is rainforest spelled with 2 words? Salem somehow immediately understands this to mean that she'd rather be in the rainforest. She really would be better off doing the research. If this comic had guts, it'd at least mention that you could get a bad fever or something from going to the rainforest. If not, outright have Sabrina get sick and have to get cured afterwards. Rainforests are dangerous places, so I hope that's going to be the conflict of the episode. Story. Because that'll be educational and kind of exciting. I'm expected to believe the absolute bullshit that Sabrina can't warp to the rainforest because her magical powers aren't fully developed. It sounds like the animated series was overthinking things when it's freaking magic. It doesn't develop. You have it or you don't. Who ever heard of it getting better as you age? It's not like magic is a physical body. I can understand getting more experience with doing magic, but it shouldn't be hard for her to just say a spell about being in the rainforest. I guess she couldn't go there because if she hadn't been to any part of a rainforest, she wouldn't be able to accurately imagine herself in any particular part of it because she wouldn't have memorized the surroundings of any part of it. But I assume that won't be an issue, meaning there's no point in her saying this. She could have warped there and she'd look cool instead of needing to rely on Salem. Sabrina begs Salem to teleport her to the rainforest because she's naive enough to think it'll be fun. Whatever happened to her watching nature shows? Also, whatever happened to magic is only a last resort? Now, thankfully, Sabrina has life to her because she immediately wants to use magic to research the rainforest because it's less boring than reading about it. Bullshit! Salem warped Sabrina to the Arctic tundra when it clearly mentioned rainforest in his spell and obviously would have been imagining it as a result. This story sucks. I thought it was gonna be about telling you what the rainforest is like. Unless he's got a curse on him so that all of its magic would have the opposite effect, like in that one story in an earlier Sabrina comic. There's no way this bullshit would be justified. Somehow, despite shivering in -0 temperatures, Sabrina has the presence of mind to make a quip that there's been a shipping error, instead of just instantly pointing to herself and teleporting back home. Or telling Salem to do it since she's too stupid to do it herself. In fact, she wastes even more time telling Salem the stakes instead of him just instantly warping them back home. No amount of rustiness would justify this. Why doesn't she just use pixie dust to teleport? They somehow get threatened by a polar bear, when they could have easily just warped away in the second panel. Was this supposed to be funny? Threatening? Because it clearly wasn't either. I'm just infuriated. I just have to assume that the bad stuff that happens to Sabrina is always supposed to be a joke, because otherwise, the stories would have literally nothing that's trying to be charming about them at all, other than the rare occasion that a hug happens. It was predictable that Salem's spell screwed up again, because it was clearly the joke they were going to go for. Either that or just a series of plot twists that the whole story was planning on being based on. Because again, it sure as hell doesn't seem like it'd be funny. He clearly said rainforest. It wasn't funny the first time, so why would you do it again? Somehow they warp to a hot desert, and it says Salem or Sabrina instantly warping away in the second panel. Salem's already dizzy and wastes time talking about it. And then says he'll head over to an oasis because he's somehow already very thirsty. And Salem's really a sociopath when you get right down to it, because he says the oasis is all his. Even Sonic Underground did this better. At least Manic was stranded in the desert for a long time before he saw Mirage. This trope is such an overused thing that I'm just bored and annoyed by wasting my time. It happened in the Knuckles miniseries too. It happened in Sonic Boom. So this wasn't worth them spending more time in the desert. Why do the characters have to be punished for using magic like this? The story would have worked fine as a punishment for reckless use of magic, and therefore a punishment for stupidity. And it would be stupid use of magic if they warped to the rainforest and suffered for realistic reasons from being in a rainforest. Sabrina has to shake him to snap him out of it, and tells him to think of cool mist rising out of the river of a rainforest. It's misty, but a lot cooler than she expected because all he did was warp them to a river that's already headed for a waterfall because Diabolus Ex Machina, and cliche. There's no reason he'd have thought of a waterfall too, because he wouldn't want that. Salem saves her with anti-gravity, and she immediately tells him to take them home when they hadn't even gotten into the actual rainforest yet, making the whole story pointless. Sabrina says she's learned 2 lessons. One is to do homework without shortcuts. She learned that lesson the wrong way. And second, she learned to not let Salem get involved. Is she really going to learn this lesson? Or is this going to be forgotten so that we could have another story like this? How do you manage to screw the story up? She didn't even get to take a shortcut in the first place. At least I got to see Salem have to mop up the floor wearing an apron as a punishment. And he wouldn't mop up the floor, he would just point and clean it up. The first story was just unbearable nonsense. After a bunch of padding, when we could have easily just seen Sabrina get told about the Tooth Fairy and then go to sleep right away, it turns out Salem's cat instincts caused him to pounce on the Tooth Fairy and break his wing when he just woke up from a nap, since he thought something was gonna threaten Sabrina. But before he started napping, he was warning her to humor the Tooth Fairy. Wouldn't he have anticipated that he'd make a mistake like this from the Tooth Fairy waking him up and make sure to sleep somewhere else? He knew he was coming. Then it turns out that because Salem instinctively revealed he could talk, the Tooth Fairy realized that because Sabrina's a witch, he had an excuse to use her as a replacement for his root for the night, as opposed to Salem, who was the one who actually heard him, and logically would have been stopped from running out of the room with magic effortlessly. No, instead Sabrina's turned into a fairy. He's a witch too. I hope I'm supposed to just assume that it's impossible for a witch to change themselves back on their own, and impossible for a witch to have their magic affect a fairy. That was true in the 90s comic too, but it's not explained here, so if you don't have that assumption, the story will look stupid because of a glaring plot hole where Sabrina's too stupid to just save herself. Why didn't Sabrina or Salem just heal the broken wing immediately? I guess because magic can't affect it. That doesn't justify Sabrina never coming up with that idea. Salem should have said that. Why did the Tooth Fairy heal his own wing? well, was healed at the end of the story, so I hope I was supposed to assume that he killed himself, and only used this as an excuse to get a break from his job. Logically, the way a tooth fairy would work, assuming it even makes sense for someone to be creepy enough to want to do that job at all and leave money for it, the way it would work is that he'd be invisible and not be able to make any noise. He has powerful magic. Instead, Sabrina has a difficult time sometimes, though usually she has as easy a job as you'd expect. It's impossible to believe she wouldn't have been spotted and freaked out, that bully, and that old man didn't react nearly strongly enough to sing her. He somehow just called her a bug. Is that it? Is the spell making everyone see her as just a bug? Is that why the iguana put his tongue on her? At least him being a guy tried to make it a little creative, even if he was ugly. Since he mentions a root, and Sabrina couldn't have possibly collected as many teeth as possible in just a single night, I assume there's multiple tooth fairies, at the speed she was working at. But it's even harder to believe that more than one would exist. Why would there be a job of collecting teeth and leaving Earth coins behind? I guess it's a charity. I was immediately annoyed and bored with the mere mention of the tooth fairy. What is the point of once again having a story that references this concept, which is already used a ton of times anyways, if you're not going to care enough to write how it would logically go? For the second story, sure there wasn't any magic in this story, but it was an interesting plot because I've never seen it before. It had the characters panicked over something, and that kept me engaged the whole way through. I've never seen a plot where the characters panic over the fact that someone's chip collection was eaten and wanted to cover it up before, so that still managed to be creative enough to impress me. Even if them wanting to be with a bunch of assholes just because they're labeled the popular girls was an annoying cliche that aggravated me. I'm so glad Jem was barely a part of the story instead of staying there for the whole thing as an antagonist like I expected. But the entire plot was kind of forced. Chloe's supposed to be her friend. The Sabrina I know would have zapped up the chips and drinks and had a party ready in no time. It's impossible to believe that a witch would barely use her magic, especially for spells that should be really easy. And it was out of character for Chloe to not encourage Sabrina to use her cool magic to undo the problem, and instead just tell her to be honest, just to force Quigley not to be mad at them. But at least there was a happy ending that revealed that Quigley wasn't in fact a total idiot in this story. And the third story was a confusing, clumsy mess. Sabrina wants to do a report on rainforests, but she's too lazy to research it, so she plans on going there. The Sabrina I know would simply warp to a rainforest. Instead, she thinks she needs Salem to do it, and somehow he screws up twice, despite clearly saying the words rainforest, and nothing in his spells implied anything else would happen. And I refuse to believe that Salem would get rusty with magic in this comic. He used magic to swat a fly. What was so hard about just having a story that portrayed almost all of the realistic problems with being in a rainforest? Which Sabrina probably should have known about already. Instead, the closest she gets to it is being in a river. And somehow she immediately gives up when she was right there. At least Salem was punished for frustrating us.